Hi, welcome to the lecture on the New World. This lecture will take a look at American culture and history, starting in the period prior to the arrival of the Europeans, approximately in the 1300s, and then leading up to the dawning of European contact in the late 14 and early 1500s. Important trends that I would like to stress in this lecture are first and foremost the nature of Native American cultures and civilizations. It's important to remember that Native Americans were just kind of reaching their peak in terms of their civilizational development in the late 1400s and early 1500s. And unfortunately for them, they came into contact with a civilization that had been evolving and developing for more than 1,000 years before them. And as is often the case when cultures meet, technology plays a very important role in how the outcome of that cultural meeting or cultural conflict will result. Now, if we take a look, for example, at a major Native American civilization in Central America, we would notice the Aztec civilization, which starts approximately in the 1300s and is going to basically survive a few decades after that European contact. The Aztec civilization was similar to previous Central American empires in terms of its military skills, technology, and prowess. Interesting things we can note about the Aztec civilization pertain particularly to their religion. It was under the Aztec civilization that human sacrifice became more than just a practice or ritualized piece of Native American religion, but also became, under the Aztecs, the state's expression of its religious ritualization. Other things we can note, which are kind of interesting, is the introduction or the elevation of a new god in the Native American pantheon, a god by the name of Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was a very interesting god in that he was against the use of human sacrifice, and he is usually depicted, other than a winged serpent or winged dragon, he's also kind of legendarily depicted as a fair-skinned god. Now, the Aztec civilization came to power in defeating the previous Native American civilization of the area, known as the Toltecs. Its capital city was the city called Tenochtitlan, which is today basically one of the areas of modern-day Mexico City. The Aztecs were thriving in the mid-1400s and even late 1400s, and when they came into contact with the Europeans, they made the unfortunate mistake of basically inviting the Spaniards, the Spanish conquistadors led by Hernando Cortez. They allowed them interest into the city and access to basically talking to the allies and to the subjugated peoples of the Aztec Empire. And that would ultimately prove their downfall. Basically, the Spaniards, under Cortez, were able to organize a revolution and overthrow the Aztec civilization. However, contrary to what Native Americans believed, with the destruction of the Aztec Empire, the Spaniards then moved in, consolidated control, and basically transferred rulership or domination of the Aztecs into being the domination of the Spanish government through its creation of what it called New Spain. We see a very similar situation when we take a look at South American civilizations that were primarily highlighted by the Incan civilization from 1100 to 1500. We believe that the largest South American civilization ever was the Incan civilization, and we estimate that the population was more than approximately 10 million people. The capital of the Incan civilization was the city of Cuzco, and what is perhaps most interesting or most, revolutionary about the Incans was that even though their empire was spread throughout the Andes Mountains, they were still able to utilize hydraulic engineering to carry water to those elevated agricultural areas and to produce enough food to support their massive population. However, in a similar story to the Aztecs, the Incans came into contact with the Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador once again, who would then usher in an overturn and if you will, a conquering of the Incan civilization, and once again the subjugation of the Native American peoples to a Spaniard overlordship. In North America, we see a lot of different Native American groups operating. We don't see one kind of giant monumental civilization, but rather several smaller ones. And I've attempted to try to break down Native American cultural groups into 5 basic groups. The first is the Mississippi culture, otherwise known as the mound builders of Cahokia, Missouri, and Cahokia, Illinois. The Cahokian civilization, centered on the banks of the mighty Mississippi, was predominantly agricultural based. It flourished starting as early as the 1100s AD or CE, and it was basically reaching kind of a pinnacle or technological apex or peak in the late 1300s. Now, unlike the Native American civilizations of Central and South America, the Cahokian civilization did not come into contact with European explorers right away. And because of that, we have to look at a different cause for kind of the decline of the Mississippi culture, which we believe is related more often or more likely to a lack of food production, which caused widespread kind of shortages in food, which led to the abandonment of major urban centers for the Mississippi cultural groups. And the Native American tribes kind of broke apart into a more regionalized, smaller civilizational model. If we take a look at the southwest portion of the United States or of North America, we would there find another major Native American culture, commonly referred to as the Anasazi culture. Now, these Anasazi cultural / tribal groups did actually live in large-scale urban settlements, as the picture you can see over here illustrates. Their cities were predominantly built out of stone and primarily located on cliff tops or in nooks and crevices of major rock formations. We call the Anasazi a cliff-dwelling culture in that most of their urban centers and societies were actually based on the sides or overlooking cliffs. Similar to the Mississippi culture, the Anasazi culture would eventually fragment and break up prior to European arrival with, we believe, again, shortages in food or a lack of complexity that enabled it to grow to a certain size. Our third group are what I refer to as the Iroquois culture. These would have been predominantly hunters and gatherers in the American Northeast, modern day states like New York and Maine, and perhaps ranging as far south as Virginia. The Iroquois were made up of several different Native American tribes that were predominantly, since they were hunters and gatherers to a large extent of their economy, they were highly territorial and had large expanses of land that they cultivated to produce enough food to support their populations. The Iroquois did live in permanent villages, primarily sending out weekly or monthly hunting parties to surrounding areas to gather enough food for the tribe. The village architectural structure in particular is commonly referred to as a longhouse, which was kind of like a giant single-room lodge that multiple families lived within in their respective villages. Probably the largest and least defined Native American culture that I've mentioned on this PowerPoint is what I refer to as nomadic tribal culture. Now, this would have been the Native Americans that are traditionally kind of imaged or kind of pictured when people think of, quote, Indians or Native Americans. These would have been Native Americans that did not live in towns or sedentary villages, but rather in camps that could be broken down and moved as the tribes migrated to follow animal migration patterns and to also follow seasonal patterns of plant growth. The nomadic tribal cultures ranged in terms of the tribes involved, from the Apache and the Cherokee to the Choctaw. And they would have, again, utilized very basic farming methods, but nothing too large or elaborate because they were on a migratory type of lifestyle. The last group in this group that I've talked about, the last culture in this group, are the Aleut or the Inuit culture groups, which are commonly misnamed as, quote, Eskimo cultures. The Inuits were a Native American group made up again of multiple tribes that did live in sedentary, permanent villages. They primarily ate fish and also engaged in massive sea navigation because of their location in the far reaches of the North American wilderness in the north. And they would also send out month-long hunting parties across the ice of the frozen oceans to go ahead and supplement their food that they needed to, instead of the fish and what food they could gather and then preserve from the short spring season or plant rebirth season in the American Northeast and Northwest. Now, I guess probably the most important thing to note, based on all these Native American cultures, is that they were extremely complex and socially developed and evolved in terms of their diplomacy between tribes, as well as their march on what we would call the civilizational path. However, one must also note that all of the Native American cultures at this point in time, in the 1500s, employed basic weapon technology that we would classify as either hand-to-hand or human-powered projectile weapons, bows and arrows, spears, etc. And as we know from our previous introductory lecture, by the 1450s and 1500s, the Europeans, on the other end, had already began to introduce gunpowder weapons and make that shift from a hand-to-hand combat or a manual combat world to a projectile chemical combat world. So when we take a look at European contact in terms of European exploration, the first country that we take a look at and start with is the country of Portugal. Portugal was the first European country to kind of master sailing on the seas, especially when it came to sailing outside of the sight of land. Henry the Navigator, a prince of Portugal, was instrumental in funding and supporting the creation of the compass and the astrolabe, which allowed oceanic voyages for the first time to the scale that they would be practiced. The first goal of the Portuguese, as we mentioned in the introductory lecture, was to try and find a sea route to the Orient, or to basically India and China, for the purpose of trade. It would be the Portuguese that would circumnavigate the African continent, establishing multiple forts on the coastline. And it's also through the Portuguese that the European world made contact with what we call the Western African slave trade, which would then evolve that slavery aspect of Western Africa and evolve it and change it into what we call the transatlantic slave trade. As you can see on the slide, we've got a couple of key ideas and points here. The Portuguese circumnavigated the Cape of Good Hope and established a colony there in 1488. It would be the first European colony in Africa. A treaty of significant importance is the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a treaty negotiated by the papacy between Portugal and Spain. Its ramifications for the New World were quite extensive, in that it basically pushed Portugal almost completely out of New World, North American and South American colonization, except for, as you can see, the colonization of the country of Brazil. Beginning in the 1530s and kind of moving through the early 1600s, the Portuguese domination of navigation and of colonization tremendously decreased, and eventually the Portuguese would be pushed out of many of their major colonies. Probably the only colony that they maintained a serious cultural control or cultural connection with would have been the Brazilian colony in South America. Now, when we take a look at European exploration in terms of Spain, this is when we see a lot of dynamic growth and domination by the European cultural group. As we all know, Columbus discovered the New World, and I use the term discovered very carefully, if we can call it that. He found the New World in 1492. He would make several return journeys in 1494 and beyond, and basically he began the colonization or the claiming of land in the New World for his financier country, Spain. I think Columbus is blamed for a lot of the disease epidemics that took place, and I don't discount that he is in fact the cause of those disease epidemics, but one has to really keep in mind that the concept of biological entities smaller than you could see, i.e. basically, I'm drawing a mental block here for a second, basically microscopic organisms was completely unheard of. And so even though Columbus would have been carrying several European diseases like smallpox and might have been a carrier for several things, he would not have actively known that. And so even though he is the cause of the introduction of smallpox, or his group is the cause of the introduction of smallpox into the New World, we can't necessarily lay a serious kind of finger pointing at Columbus in that he did this knowingly. In the aftermath of Columbus's journey to the New World, of course, we have the arrival of Hernando Cortez. We have the arrival of Ponce de Leon, who explored Florida and created a colony there. We have the arrival of Pizarro, who defeated the Incas. And basically, from the 1500s, the early 1500s, the turn of the century into the 1500s, until the 1530s, it's a predominant kind of expansion of the Spanish and a replication, if you will, or a replacement of the Native American cultures that dominated with a politically dominant European cultural model, which would then slowly, over the course of a couple centuries, systematically replace Native American culture. One thing that I would especially point out is the date on point number F, the Spanish implementation of a plantation system in 1550, or around the year 1550. And what that refers to is that the Spanish, in terms of the people sent to New Spain in order to farm and kind of produce and create a living, they systematically implemented a wide-scale farming system that required cheap or free labor. And it's because of that initially, once this system was adopted, first and foremost, the Spanish utilized and enslaved Native American populations to try and do this labor. But as time went on and those Native American populations either decreased due to disease or decreased due to emigration out of the area, it would be the Spanish that would really buy heavily into the transatlantic slave trade and kind of create that triangular trade model that you might have heard referenced in terms of sugar going to Europe, guns going to Africa to trade for slaves, slaves going to the New World in order to work in the sugar fields in Central and South America, and a little bit later to work in the tobacco fields of North America. So the introduction of the plantation system into the New World, particularly in New Spain, would have serious and horrific consequences for the African populations on the continent. Just to kind of finish up New Spain, We have the creation of the first European colony in North America in 1565. And as the slide points out, New Spain extended from the upper reaches of Georgia all the way to the bottom reaches of the country of Peru. Another country we can take a look at is the country of France. Now, as we can see based on the dates here, France got into the American colonization game fairly late. They were forced to kind of colonize areas in northern North America, primarily what we today call parts of Canada, and they had to also colonize parts of North America west of the Mississippi, because the other areas on the coastal part of North America were taken by the British and by the Spanish. We do have the creation of a French base at Nova Scotia in 1605, and we have the attempt to create the first French colony in 1642. But as you can see, that's almost a century later than the colonies that were established by the Spanish. Now, the model of the French exploration and colonization was somewhat limited by the fact that the French had a hard time convincing people to leave France and migrate or immigrate to the New World. Because of that, the primary source of revenue for the French colonies was what we would call pelting or animal pelts. And that was predominantly a colonization or a market economy that was driven by French people, French males predominantly, coming to the New World, living a period of about 1 to 3 years in the New World, collecting pelts, and then basically selling those pelts or taking them back to France and selling them for a much greater profit. The long and the short result of this is that France had a very hard time establishing major colonies, and for the most part was kind of left out of the North American land grab that took place in the late 14 and 1500s. The Dutch Empire would not be left out of this colonization effort. They did gain colonies in North America, primarily what is modern-day New York. They gained, of course, New Netherland and New Amsterdam. But the biggest kind of impetus of wealth and Dutch interest in the New World came in the form of the transatlantic slave trade. The Dutch would push the Portuguese out of the slave trade by as early as the early to mid 1600s, and they would likewise push the Portuguese out of the South African colony that they had created on the tip of Africa, and they would create their own colony, which is called Cape Town, in 1652. The last kind of country that we'll talk about when it comes to European exploration would be the country of England. Now, England got very heavily involved in colonization early on. As you can see, John Henry Cabot claimed land in America for England in 1498. But then you'll also notice there's about a 100-year gap between the claiming of land and the creation of the first colony. And the reason for that has primarily to do with political and militarily and wars, conflicts within England, civil wars, in that time period, which kind of led to that destabilization. We do have the founding of the first colony in the New World, the English colony of Roanoke, founded first in 1585 and again in 1587, and that is the so-called famed lost colony of Roanoke. In order to kind of oversee their New World endeavors, the British government created what was called the British East Indies Company, a company that was centered in India and kind of focused on Asian domination, Asian trade, and the British West Indies Company, which focused on British actions in terms of the Caribbean and on the coastal areas of North America. Our first colony is Virginia, established in 1607. That was the first permanent lasting colony. We then have, of course, Plymouth Landing and Colony in 1620. and the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. Now, as this colonization continued, the population of the European colonies continued to increase, and that is when we begin to see the beginnings of violence or conflict between the Native Americans and the English, or the Indians and the English, in terms of North American history. The Pequot War was fought in 1636, and we see the, quote, resolution to the Pequot War being the creation of what were called reservations. The idea that the English would basically force the Native Americans onto a particular area of land and basically keep them out of the way, and then later on force them off that land if the Europeans or if the English wanted that land at a later point. We have some dates in there about new colonies: Maryland in 1632, Rhode Island in 1636, and one interesting kind of point of trivia about Rhode Island is that Rhode Island was the first colony that exercised or practiced religious toleration in theory. Now, I say that because it was religious tolerant to all Protestant religions, but Roman Catholicism was still looked down upon and targeted. Pennsylvania, founded in 1677 to 1681. And then pretty much what you see is that we have a series of wars. King Philip's War, French and Indian Wars, named William's War, Anne's War, George's War. What we see developing from the mid-1600s until basically the year of 1763, we see an increasing number of conflicts between first the Native Americans and the English, and later on the French and the English, as there is a competition and a race to see who's going to control the northern coast of North America. Just in case you were interested, I also put on the outline the dates for the Salem witch trials, 1692 to 1693. And last but not least, I gave you an idea of what was going on in terms of population growth of the British colonies. So, starting in the year 1700, the population of the British colonies was approximately 275,000. And by 1740, 40 years later, that population had almost tripled to 889,000. And as you might expect, all of that increasing population required more land, which meant more conflict and antagonism with the Native Americans. That's a lot of information. I hope that it's not too long for you, but I thought it was a good idea to kind of set the basis for the new, quote, modern world and the introduction of a new part of the world that the Europeans prior to 1400 didn't have widespread knowledge about, which would have been North and South America. Now, since this is a world history course, we will not focus too heavily on North and South American history prior to the year 1900. In fact, mostly what we'll talk about in relation to American history is how it relates to key events in world history. For example, the French Revolution. We'll talk about the American Revolution and link it to the French Revolution in terms of effects and things like that. Likewise, we'll talk about America's introduction into imperialism and building an overseas empire in the mid to late 1800s when we talk about such countries as China and Japan. I hope that this lecture is helpful. I hope that it can help at least get you thinking about the topic of the New World and how it relates to world history. And I hope that if you need to, definitely you don't hesitate to pause it as you're watching it or listening to it. But I think it's a lot of important information that will help set the groundwork for later lectures. Once again, this is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I thank you for taking this course, and thank you for watching this video.